Hi everyone, it's time for our next topic of discussion. We're going to be talking about Chapter 2, which is about cells. I'm going to break this lecture apart into two different pieces. I'm actually going to talk about the components of cells in this lecture, Lecture 1, and then there's a second part, which is going to be Part 2, which is going to talk about how cells multiply. So let's go through today's agenda. So we're going to talk about the difference between two different types of cells, something called prokaryotes and eukaryotes. And then we're going to kind of just focus specifically on one type of cell. That happens to be these eukaryotic cells. We'll talk about the cellular components, we'll talk about membranes and organelles, we'll talk about all of the pieces of the cell so that we can sort of understand how the cells function, again, as it relates to then our traits and our DNA. So we'll talk about where our DNA is inside of a cell and what pieces of cellular machinery are used in order to express those proteins that gives us the traits that we'll be talking about. All right, so as it turns out, there's not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to different types of cells. Cells are highly specialized to do whatever job it is they're meant to do. So our bodies include more than 260 different cell types. So if you were to take a look at a cell, a skin cell, for example, and you were to take a look at a heart cell, they would look very, very different from each other. The reason is because they have two very different functions. So that's the really great thing about multicellular organisms such as humans, is that we are able to differentiate, that's what we call it, our cells, give them different jobs to do. And as it turns out, what makes a heart cell, and what makes a skin cell happens to be the genes that are active in each of those. So once again, it all comes back to our genetics. So a heart cell knows how to be a heart cell because only the proteins it needs to be a heart cell are actually produced. Those genes are turned on. And in the case of a skin cell, only the genes that the cell needs in order to be a skin cell are turned on. So that's how we're differentiating our cells. So your somatic cells, which again are just the cells that sort of are used to make up your entire body. Remember, you have two copies of your genome. We said genome last time in our last lecture was all of the DNA, all of those A's, C's, T's, and G's. That genetic code, your entire set of genetic instructions is your genome. And you get two copies of it. You get one from mom and one from dad. And we have a special term that we use for these cells. We call these cells diploid cells. They have two copies of our genetic instructions. There's another set of cells that you have that are different. They only contain one copy of the genome, and these happen to be your sex cells. So for males, these are sperm cells, and for females, these are egg cells. And you only have a single copy of the genome in these, and we refer to these cells as being haploid. They have half of the amount of genetic information. Now, when you think about it, it makes sense why you would want sperm cells and egg cells to only have one copy of the genome, because during a fertilization event, when a sperm and egg cell meet together, they each bring that one copy that they have, and they create then a zygote that has two copies. Another type of cell that's slightly different from the somatic cells and the sperm cells that I just want to briefly mention are stem cells. So stem cells are a special line of cells that are able to both replicate themselves, and they're also able to become different types of cells, and depending on the stem cell depends on how many different types of cells it can become. We're going to talk about stem cells later on in another lecture when we're talking about genetic technologies, but I did just want to note that there are sort of the stem cells are the precursors to the somatic cells that we have in our bodies. All right, so let's take a real quick look, and actually I'm going to move this down a little bit here so you guys can see all of this information. I think I mentioned in the last lecture that your cells are made up of molecules. We have four main types of molecules that make up all of the different pieces of your cells. So we have the carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are things like starches and sugars. They give our cells energy, but they also help to make structures in our cell. Lipids are another category. These would be fats and oils. This is the basis of the hormones that we use, the chemical signals in our bodies. It also forms some important membranes that we're going to discuss, and then it provides some insulation and a way to store energy. And then there's the proteins. I've mentioned proteins before. Proteins are what your DNA codes for, and your proteins do so many different things. They can be antibodies, they can be enzymes that help reactions occur, they can be structural. They're kind of a jack of all trades, if you will. And then the last type of molecule we're going to talk about are the nucleic acids, which we're going to devote an entire lecture to nucleic acids and proteins, for all that matter. Those are the DNA and RNA molecules. DNA and RNA are different. They are not the same. So far I've mentioned DNA to you, but I haven't mentioned RNA to you. DNA and RNA are both important for taking, again, this information in our genes, how to make proteins, and turning it into actual physical products. All right. Oops, sorry about this. Let me readjust my screen here so that you guys can see all of this. All right, so there's two different types of cells as far as living things are concerned. We have the prokaryotic cells and what are referred to as eukaryotic cells. So prokaryotic cells are the simplest living things on the planet. Think of bacteria. There's another group called the extremophiles, the thermophiles. They're kind of like bacteria, the archaeans, but they're not exactly bacteria. In any case, they're the simplest type of life form that you can imagine. They have a plasma membrane, a container to live in. They have genetic information so they can make copies of themselves. And they have a couple of pieces like ribosomes so that they can actually physically make proteins, but they don't have anything else. They don't have specialized structures. They don't have a nucleus to hold their genetic information. They're very, very small, and they're very, very simple. Eukaryotic cells, on the other hand, are everything else. So if you're not a bacteria and you're not an archaean, you are a eukaryotic cell. Plants, animals, and fungi, protists, all different groups, we all fall into this category. So we are different in that we compartmentalize every function of the cell. So anything that needs to get done in your cell, there is a specific compartment where it gets done, and those compartments are organelles. So each organelle in your cell has a specific job to do. So let's take a look at a very general, this would be a very general, what we're calling animal cell. And what you can see is that it's jam-packed, right? There's an awful lot of stuff inside of this cell if you break it open. So we're going to talk about the different components and the different pieces, and we're going to talk about sort of this outer covering first, and then we're going to make our way inside the cell and take a look at all of these brightly colored organelles. So we'll talk about the nucleus, and we'll talk about the endomembrane system and the mitochondria, and we'll talk about some of these other more important features and functions of a cell. So again, the great thing about organelles is that you can split up the functions of a cell and have each organelle doing a very specific job. It's a very specialized and highly organized way to function as a cell. We could be like the bacteria and we could just sort of let things happen as they do, but it wouldn't be very effective. And especially when we're talking about organisms where multicellular organisms, where we have different cells that are parts of different tissues, that are part of different organs and organ systems that have very specific functions to do. We want to make sure that the chemical reactions going on inside of those cells is regulated, and it's very controlled based on what the cell is supposed to be doing. So you want your heart cell to function like a heart cell, and you want your lung cells to function like lung cells. So organization is key. So the great thing about organelles is, again, we can give ourselves the ability to retain and use genetic instructions. We can acquire energy. We can secrete substances. We can do everything in a very organized manner. All right, so let's start on the outside of the cell. All cells are enclosed by a structure called a plasma membrane. This is the gatekeeper. This is the wall to the city. If you want to think of our cell like a city, this would be the wall to the city. And the plasma membrane's job is to figure out who comes in and who leaves the cell. So it's all about regulation. So these membranes are made up of a special type of molecule referred to as phospholipids. So remember, lipids were one of those categories that we talked about as far as the major macromolecules that make cells up. Lipids are one of these, and phospholipids are a little unique in that they have a fatty acid tail and a phosphate head. But what it enables it to do is it enables these lipids to form a bilayer. So you don't just have one layer of these molecules, you actually have two layers of these molecules with a bunch of proteins embedded inside of them. And you have a liquid, water-based environment both inside the cell and outside the cell. So this is kind of what it would look like. So here are two different ways to look at this phospholipid bilayer. So as you can see, we have these gray phosphate heads and these hydrophobic fatty acid tails. What does hydrophobic mean? Hydrophobic means water-hating. On the other side, we have these phospholipids, which are hydrophilic. That means they love water. So areas where you find water, which is outside the cell and inside the cell, you want these phosphate heads to be pointing outwards. And in between, we have this hydrophobic region, which is helping to prevent molecules from just freely moving through here. And then we have a whole bunch of proteins, and these proteins are basically like channels. So they can help different things move through the membrane. We also have different proteins that are actually used for chemical signaling. So cells have a sense of self. They know what is part of the body and what is foreign. So all of these proteins sort of help for communication and identification. So again, membranes are semi-permeable. Some things can come through, but other things cannot. Water can freely cross the membrane, and very small non-charged molecules, things that are very, very tiny that are not charged, can move through the membrane freely. Other than that, everything has to be moved across. All right, so let's take a quick break here and do a comprehension check. So which of the following forms the two layers of the cell membrane? The nucleic acids, the proteins, the lipids, carbohydrates, or enzymes? If you said lipids, you would be correct. There are proteins embedded in it, but the layer itself is made up entirely of those phospholipid bilayers. All right, so let's move on quickly and talk about some of the things inside of the cell. We're going to start with the most obvious component of a cell, and that happens to be the nucleus. The nucleus is where we're storing all of our genetic information. So if we're going back to our city, you can kind of think of the nucleus like the library, the town library. All of the information that that town contains, all of its knowledge, all of its information is in that library. Same thing with the nucleus. All of the information on how to build and maintain you as an organism is contained inside of that nucleus. So we have the nucleus contains different pieces. So inside is a small structure called the nucleolus, which is actually responsible for making something called ribosomes, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And then you have the DNA itself. DNA can come in two forms, a loose, messy form called chromatin, and a tightly condensed form called chromosomes. When your cells are doing what your cells do on a normal daily basis, it's chromatin. It's loose, it's unbound, all of the genes are easily accessible so that we can make copies of those and make proteins. When your cell gets ready to divide, we go in a different direction and we bind that DNA up super, super tight so that we can move it around the cell. So here's our nucleus, little tiny pores, which again allow only certain things to go in and out of the nucleus. We have more phospholipids creating this membrane once again, so we can tightly control who has access to that genetic information. Surrounding the nucleus happens to be the cytoplasm. Okay, that's all of the other stuff. So between the plasma membrane and the nucleus, we refer to all of the other contents of the cell as the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm contains organelles, which are all these little membrane-bound sacs that we're going to talk about, and also the actual fluid that everything's kind of floating in. So the cytosol is what we refer to that as. And then last but not least, we have components of what's called a cytoskeleton. So there actually is some internal shape and structure here. It's not just a bag of water with things floating in it. We actually do have very specific proteins, microfilaments and microtubules that are providing structure for your cells. All right, quick overview of The organelles. Let's talk about mitochondria first. Your mitochondria are responsible for the energy that your body needs to survive. It makes a molecule called ATP. ATP is the energy currency of your cell. Nothing gets done in your cell without ATP. They're like little rechargeable batteries that you constantly need to replace. We use our food to make those batteries. So every time you eat a banana, an apple, a Big Mac, drink a Coke, whatever it happens to be, we're going to take molecules out of that, mostly sugar molecules, glucose, and we're going to turn them into energy. So the interesting thing about mitochondria is that they have their own DNA and they actually replicate themselves. So we don't have instructions inside of our nuclear DNA on how to make mitochondria because mitochondria have their own DNA. What's also interesting is that you only inherit mitochondria from your mom. So dad's little sperm cell doesn't have any mitochondria in it to contribute to you, but mom's egg cell does. And so there's a direct maternal line then as we pass down mitochondrial DNA from one generation to the next. Kind of an interesting side note. All right, here's our mitochondria. It looks like a bean with some folds inside. The folds are super important when it comes to the process of cellular respiration. That's the process we use to make ATP. Don't worry, I'm not going to test you on what cellular respiration is. That's another biology class for another time. All you need to know is that the mitochondria make ATP and energy. Next are the ribosomes. Ribosomes are little workbenches. They are workbenches where we assemble proteins. So proteins happen to be very large molecules that are made up of smaller subunits called amino acids. To assemble a protein, you need to put together a very specific order of amino acids, and that's what ribosomes do. Some ribosomes are just floating in the cytoplasm. Some of them are actually bound to another membrane structure called the endoplasmic reticulum. Speaking of which, let's talk about the ER. The ER, endoplasmic reticulum, is part of what's called the endomembrane system. Your endomembrane system is all of those big folded, flattened sacs and discs that were sort of taking up a really large space inside your cell. We do all kinds of things here in the endomembrane system. We make things like lipids and proteins. We store things. We transport things. We package. We process. I don't know, it's kind of like maybe like a UPS hub or something for your town, if we're going back to our city analogy. By the way, the mitochondria would have been the power plants in your city. Our endomembrane system is kind of like the manufacturing distribution warehouse in your city. So ER comes in two types, rough and smooth. Rough is rough because it has a bunch of ribosomes on it. Smooth is because it doesn't have any ribosomes on it. Rough ER tends to be flattened and sac-like. Smooth ER tends to be more tubular in structure. So we make different things. Rough ER makes proteins. Smooth ER makes phospholipids and steroids and fatty acids and all the lipids you need. So here's your endomembrane system again. Here's the rough ER. Here's the smooth ER. So rough ER makes proteins. Smooth ER makes lipids. Next comes the Golgi. The Golgi is a protein processing center. We attach sugars to the proteins. We fold them here, which I'll talk about more later on. Again, it looks like a bunch more flattened sacs and discs. That's all it looks like. Next, I'm going to talk about briefly of the lysosomes. So the lysosomes are little membrane-bound sacs that contain digestive enzymes that break down food. These are the garbage trucks and recycling centers of your town, if, once again, your cell was a city. And then we have the cytoskeleton. So the cytoskeleton is a meshwork of proteins and rods and tubules. There's three different main types: microtubules, microfilaments, and intermediate filaments. I'm not going to go into huge discussion on what these do. These give your cells the internal structure they need to basically withstand the fluid on the outside of them. So these create little highways that the different vesicles sort of run along. So they anchor all of your organelles in place. So they kind of keep everything and they give it structure, which is why we kind of refer to it as a skeleton. Even though it's not truly hard like your skeleton inside of you is, it still provides some structure for the cell. So it maintains cell shape, connects cells to each other. We can transport molecules. Some can provide motility to cells. We move chromosomes during cell division, which I'll talk about in the next lecture. It composes cilia, which some single-celled organisms use to move around. All right, which part of the cell is responsible for synthesizing proteins? Is it the ribosomes, the mitochondria, the nucleus, the cytoskeleton, or the lysosomes? Lots of ohms in this one. It's the ribosomes. Yay, ribosomes. All right, so important things you should know. Terms and concepts.